Hello there, AP Environmental Science class. All right, we're moving on now to Chapter 4, Biodiversity and Evolution. As has been the case with the past couple of chapters, there are about 40 slides here, so I'm going to split this lecture up into two parts. So we'll do about 20 slides with part 1, and then about the rest of the 20 slides in part 2. So we start off this chapter with a core case study. Why are amphibians vanishing? So just a reminder, what is an amphibian? Amphibian is an animal that lives part of its life in the water, part of its life out on land, like a salamander or like a frog. They are very important amphibians. They're very sensitive biological indicators. They're very important to environmental science for a couple of reasons. Number one, they live some of their life in the water and some of their life on land. So by looking at amphibians and if they're becoming extinct or if they're having some problems, quote unquote, we can not only know if the aquatic ecosystem is going bad, but also the terrestrial ecosystem, because they live their lives in both spots. In addition, most of amphibians actually breathe through their skin, so they're in constant contact with their environment, and therefore, if just a little bit of the environment changes, it could have massive effects on amphibians. And that's what we're seeing right now. Frogs are becoming extinct at 10,000 times their historical rates. Again, amphibians, sensitive biological indicators because of the reasons I just told you. They play important ecological roles in their communities, and they're also important for humans. Skin secretions, a source of many valuable pharmaceutical products, and so not only is the environment degrading that are killing these amphibians, but also human beings. We're harvesting them, or we're capturing them to use those secretions, and that is also affecting their populations as well. So, what are the major types of life on planet Earth? We're going to start off with that. So, basically, we classify based on cell structure. So, this goes back to your biology days. Basically, two types of cells, prokaryotic and eukaryotic. Prokaryotic are your bacteria cells, and basically, they have no nucleus or any other internal parts enclosed by membranes. They have no organelles in them. Eukaryotic are a bit more developed cells. All non-bacterial organisms are eukaryotic, and eukaryotic, if we remember, have nuclei, have those inner organelles that are enclosed by membranes inside the cell itself. Species are a group of living organisms with characteristics that distinguish it from other groups of organisms. Important, they must be able to sexually reproduce with other similar individuals and produce fertile offspring to be considered a species. Okay, so that is your definition of species. Here's a picture, again, those two types of cells, just have a general understanding. All right, the prokaryotic cell here on the left, again, there's no nucleus. The DNA information is kind of just scattered around the cell. With the eukaryotic cells, we have more of those organelles, right? We have a nucleus. We have some of the other parts of the cell here, like the Golgi apparatus, things like that, okay? So those are the difference between your prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells. Obviously, prokaryotic cells came first, and then the eukaryotic cells evolved after that. We have estimated about 7 to 10 million species exist on planet Earth, but only about 2 million of those species have been identified. So think about that. Close to, maybe if you go 10 million, that would mean about 80% of the species haven't even been identified. Half of the 2 million species that have been identified, or at least about half, are insects. So yes, while human beings think we're in control, I would argue that insects are in control of the planet, as they pretty much are the largest species out there, those insects. Pollination is a vital ecosystem service performed by insects, so thank goodness that we do have them. Again, if you don't know what pollination is, when an insect goes into a flower, the pollen from that flower gets onto the insect then flies to another flower, moves the pollen from one flower to another flower, that flower then gets fertilized, and then that flower produces seeds, etc., as that plant does, that then produces a new plant down the road. So without that pollination, I would argue that we wouldn't have the diversity of plants and flowers that we have, and without that diversity of plants and flowers, we may not have as many creatures that consume them, and therefore we might not be here as human beings. So thank you, insects. Next time you see an insect, make sure to thank it. Some insect species reproduce rapidly and can produce new genetic traits. This actually leads to pesticide resistance. We'll talk a little bit about that here, but we're mainly going to talk about pesticide resistance when we talk about sustainable agriculture coming up in a couple of chapters. So, what is biodiversity and why is it important? Well, biologic diversity is the diversity of life on Earth, and we're going to talk about why it's very important. First, though, a couple of things to look at. First is called, we talk about species diversity. So species diversity includes species richness and species evenness. So what does that mean? Well, richness is the number of different species that a particular ecosystem has, okay? So if you want a lot of biodiversity, you want high species richness, right? We want a lot of different organisms, different species living together in an ecosystem. That would be an ecosystem with a high richness, okay? Evenness is comparing the population of those individual species in that ecosystem. So for instance, if we have 13 wolves in an ecosystem and 20,000 rabbits, well then obviously that ecosystem is not very even, okay? If we had 12 wolves and 14 rabbits, then we would say that ecosystem is a bit more even, okay? So when we talk about species diversity, we're going to talk about species richness, how many different species are living together in one ecosystem, and then the evenness, comparing the population of those species in that ecosystem. Genetic diversity is the variety of genes in a population or species, and ecosystem diversity, biomes, are regions with distinct climates and species. And we're actually going to do a couple of units where we talk about terrestrial biomes, we talk about aquatic biomes. So we will be getting into biomes in more detail coming up in a couple of weeks. All right, so forests have core habitats and edge habitats. So again, we're talking about this biodiversity and why it's important. So edge effect conditions different from the forest interior, such as temperature, light, humidity, etc. So you can almost think about forest around here, right? In the middle of a forest, you're going to have a different type of conditions than you will at the edge of a forest, right? But at the edge of the forest, you may have more light, you may have more wind affecting that, while in the middle of the forest, maybe it's darker because the trees, the canopies block out the light. Maybe you're not getting a lot of wind. You know, the conditions are going to be different. So what's happening is, as forests are getting fragmented, and again, we'll talk more about this a little more when we talk about the forest biomes, but there is less core habitat and more edge habitat. You think about it, as you take a big forest and you cut it in half, right? Now all of a sudden the core has gone away and you have basically more edges, and then you cut those in half, right? And now you have more edge habitat and less core habitat. And of course, that's going to unfortunately change the biodiversity in your forest, because the species that can live in the middle of the forest and now are having some problems because the middle of the forest, when it gets cut in half, becomes the edge of the forest, et cetera, et cetera. Ecotone is just a transitional area where two different ecosystems merge. So, functional diversity. This is the variety of processes within the ecosystem, okay? So again, more types of diversity we're talking about here are functional diversity. So examples, energy flow and matter cycling, right? We'll talk about how some biomes have a better handle of cycling their matter compared to other biomes. And again, that'll be the functional diversity of different ecosystems. And we'll talk more about that as we go through the next couple of weeks. Advantages of biologically diverse ecosystems. So again, why do we want this biodiversity? What are the advantages? Well, they produce more plant biomass to support a greater number of consumer species, right? We spoke about how you have your primary producers, and then you have your consumers, right? Primary, secondary, tertiary. Well, the more biologically diverse, the more plant biomass. So that supports a greater number of species. Contains species traits that enable them to adapt to changing environmental conditions. All right, we're going to talk about how when you actually have an ecosystem with a lot of biodiversity to it, if something happens to that ecosystem, it actually can adapt and change better than if you have a ecosystem with very little biological diversity. So for instance, a desert which doesn't have a lot of biological diversity, if you go ride an ATV in a desert and destroy a desert biome, it takes many years for that desert biome to recover from the damage. However, we take an ATV and drive it in the forest here in Ardsley, right? While it's going to do some damage, that damage will be mitigated quicker by the ecosystem because it is more biologically diverse, right? Forests more biologically diverse than deserts, and so they actually recover from damage better, quicker. And again, we'll talk more about that as we go through the course as well. So this is basically natural capital. All right. So we talked about this term. This is what the Earth provides for itself. So again, we have your functional diversity, genetic diversity, species diversity, ecological diversity. Okay, and all this diversity helps with that natural capital. And again, more on that to come. And we can actually look at it a little bit here. So this talks about how this is the community structure. And if you remember back to a previous lesson, I said that most of the biodiversity is actually in our rainforests, right? And the least are in our deserts. I think this picture kind of begins to tell the story, right? So look at your tropical rainforest. You have basically from the floor of the rainforest all the way up to the top of the canopy, which is in this about 100 feet, right? You have different creatures living, right, at each different level here in the tropical rainforest. So think about all the biological diversity that you could have in a tropical rainforest, right? Some creatures are living up here, different creature living here, different here, more on the floor of the forest. You'll notice coniferous forests, a little shorter, kind of like deciduous. But again, you're going to have a lot of biodiversity because you're going to have a lot of creatures living at different levels in the forest, and each creature living at different levels is going to evolve, right, to a species that is best fit for its environment. Maybe living at the top of the tree, right, you get more sun. Living at the bottom of the forest here, you're not going to get a lot of sun, so the species evolve, and that creates different species. So you have a lot of area for that biodiversity. You'll know as you get down to the desert scrub here, don't really have much places for animals and plants to live, right? Pretty much right down at the bottom. That's about it. And that obviously decreases the biodiversity of the area. So again, when we get into our biomes, we'll talk about this in more detail, but just understand this community structure. And this is why most of your biodiversity is in those tropical rainforests, while desert doesn't really have that biodiversity. And again, this is what we talked about a couple of chapters ago. You start clear-cutting tropical rainforests, you are really disrupting the biological diversity on our planet. All right, here are some major biomes for you. Okay, the chaparral up here in California, the coniferous forest, the deserts, etc., grasslands, forests. Again, we will be talking about these in more detail coming up in another chapter. All right, so what role do species play in ecosystems? Well, each species plays a specific ecological role called its niche, right? Or niche. Either way, you could pronounce it, okay? So this includes everything that affects survival and reproduction, like water, space, sunlight, food, and temperature. There are two types of species that I want you to know about. One are generalist species, and the other are called specialist species. And what the difference is, generalist species have a broad niche, right? They have a wide range of tolerance, while specialist species have a very narrow niche or a narrow range of tolerances. So you could probably imagine we as human beings are generalist species. We live in a wide range of areas, right? We live in the deserts. We live in the Arctic areas. We live in the temperate forests. We live on islands in the middle of the ocean. We live everywhere. We're considered a generalist species. Specialist species has that narrow range of tolerance. So for instance, a panda bear, right? Or a koala bear. They only live in a little area in Asia. They only eat a certain food. And so they have a very narrow range of tolerance. So obviously, when it comes to extinction, which we'll talk about soon, your specialist species are going to be quicker to become extinct than your generalist species, because your specialist species really can only live in a narrow range of environments, while generalist species can exist in a broader range. So again, again, here we have a specialist is your panda. The example the book gives of a generalist, it doesn't give humans, it gives a raccoon, right? So again, here is that it's the number of individuals, the resource use, and you'll notice, right, for the panda bear, you really have to be right in this little area here of resource use. But the generalist species has a wider curve, okay, meaning that it can live in a larger area. Okay, so that's what we're going to talk about when we talk about specialist and generalist species. All right, so there are four major ecosystem roles for species. Native species normally live and thrive in their particular ecosystem. Non-native species, which we call invasive species, migrate or are accidentally introduced into an ecosystem. We have indicator species, we talked about that with the amphibians, which provide an early warnings of environmental change. And then we have something called keystone species, which have a large effect on the types and abundance of other species in that ecosystem. So the American alligator is considered a keystone species. So one of the case studies, we talk about this keystone species that almost went extinct. So the alligator is a keystone species in its subtropical wetland ecosystem. It digs gator holes that hold fresh water and serve as a refuge for aquatic life. In the 1930s, they were hunted for sport, meat, and skin. 1967, added to the endangered species list. But this is a positive story, and I try to highlight, because we talk all about negative stories in this class, but there are a lot of positive stories in environmental science as well, and this is a positive one. We knew what was going on in the late 60s, early 70s with the American alligator, and so what did we do? We basically protected them, right? We put them on an endangered species list, and we'll talk about that more in subsequent chapters. And as a result, by 1977, it only took 10 years, and they made an impressive comeback, and now we have more than 1 million alligators in Florida today. So just showing you that you can make a difference, right? We all can make a difference. This isn't all negative, right? There's definitely some positive as long as we can see what we're doing and then stop it and mitigate the things that we're doing. So here he is, our old guy, the American alligator. All right, just wanted to show you a picture of that. All right, just a couple of slides left to this part one. We'll talk about Science Focus 4.1, again, causes of amphibian decline. So once again, we talked about this at the beginning, kind of reintroducing it again because we just spoke about the alligator. But factors causing decline and disappearance of reptiles and amphibians are parasites, viral and fungal diseases, habitat loss, fragmentation, higher levels of UV radiation, because again, they're very sensitive to this stuff, pollution, climate change, and overhunting, okay, all leading to those amphibians becoming extinct faster than they have in pretty much the history of Earth. All right, so how does Earth's life change over time? So this is now where we're going to start talking about evolution. So we start off with biological evolution. Earth's life forms change genetically over time. It's a widely accepted scientific theory at this point. How does it happen? It occurs with something we call natural selection, process by which species have evolved from earlier species. So evolution explains how organisms change over time, right? We see fossils, physical evidence of past organisms preserved in rocks or ice, and we can see that this has actually occurred. And again, in the fossil record, entire body of fossil record is uneven and incomplete. We estimate that fossils found so far represent only about 1% of all the species that have ever lived, but they do give us a glimpse at the past and realize that there has been this evolution that has occurred, because we're seeing things in the fossil record that aren't necessarily there now, even though we can kind of trace their path. So we know that there was this evolution that occurred. And for instance, this here is an early ancestor of the horse. Again, it was much, much smaller than our modern day horse, but we begin to see some of the characteristics of the modern day horse. And then again, we can trace this horse through the fossil records and realize that this was the early ancestor of the modern day horse by, again, tracing those fossil records, tracing the evolution of the horse through the millions of years. All right, so I'm going to end it here. We'll start off next time with evolution depends on genetic variability and natural selection, and we'll talk more about that then in part 2. But as always, thanks for listening.